The doors of the Oval Office swung open, and the air inside felt different. The usual controlled chaos of Washington had paused for just a moment, as the most anticipated meeting of the year was about to take place. Every camera in the room was rolling. Every journalist in the White House press pool was holding their breath. On one side of the resolute desk sat Donald Trump, the man who had built his legacy on unpredictability, strength, and cutting through political games like a knife through butter. To his right, sitting with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what was happening, was G.D. Vance, his vice president, a man who had already become a key player in shaping the future of American politics. And across from them, Volodymyr Zelensky. The president of Ukraine had flown across the world for this meeting. On the surface, it was just another diplomatic discussion, a conversation about continued U.S. support for Ukraine. But everyone in the room knew better. This wasn't just about funding. This was about power, about leverage, about loyalty. Zelensky had come prepared. His posture was straight, his hands resting carefully in his lap. He had played this game before. He had stood before Congress, world leaders, and media giants, making his case for Ukraine. But this wasn't just any politician he was facing now. This was Trump. And Trump wasn't interested in playing by the usual Washington rules. The moment he sat down, Trump wasted no time. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the armrest, sizing Zelensky up like a businessman assessing a deal. So, Trump finally said, his voice carrying that unmistakable mix of amusement and dominance, "What exactly do you want this time?" Zelensky didn't flinch. He had expected the question. "Mr. President," he began, his accent thick but his English practiced, "Ukraine is still fighting for its survival. We need continued American support, financial aid, weapons, technology. The world is watching, and without your leadership, without America's leadership, the consequences will be severe." G.D. Vance, silent up until this point, exchanged a glance with Trump. Then, in a voice as calm as ever, he spoke. "Mr. President," Vance said, directing his words toward Zelensky, "that's what I don't understand. You talk about needing American leadership, but what I see is America footing the bill while Europe drags its feet. The American taxpayer is wondering how much longer is this supposed to go on?" The question hung in the air. The press pool shifted in their seats, sensing the tension rising. Zelensky's jaw tensed. He had faced difficult questions before, but this was different. Trump and Vance weren't just asking about the money. They were questioning the entire foundation of America's role in this war. Trump didn't let the silence drag. He leaned forward, both elbows on the desk. "We've given you more than any other country, Volodymyr. Planes, tanks, missiles, billions and billions of dollars. And yet, here you are again, sitting in front of me, asking for more." Zelensky opened his mouth to respond, but Trump wasn't finished. "Tell me something," Trump continued, his voice sharp. "When was the last time Germany stepped up the way we have? Or France? Or even your European neighbors? Why is it always the United States?" G.D. Vance added, his voice even but firm. "And while we're at it, Mr. President, how much of that money is actually reaching the front lines, and how much is disappearing into bureaucracy?" A murmur rippled through the press pool. Nobody had asked Zelensky that before. Not like this. Not to his face. Zelensky's hands clenched slightly. He was trying to keep his composure, but the cracks were beginning to show. "I understand your concerns," Zelensky said carefully, "but this is not just about Ukraine. This is about defending democracy, defending the world from a growing threat. America's role in this fight is essential." Trump smirked. He had heard enough. No, Volodymyr, he said, shaking his head. America's role is taking care of America first. And right now, Americans are watching their cities fall apart while billions go overseas. You tell me, how do I explain that to them? Silence. Zelensky had no answer. The power in the room had shifted. Trump leaned back in his chair, watching as Zelensky struggled to respond. G.D. Vance didn't move, his arms crossed, waiting. And the cameras? They caught every second of it. The world was watching. And this meeting was far from over. The air in the Oval Office was thick with tension. Zelensky sat stiffly in his chair, his carefully rehearsed responses suddenly feeling inadequate. He had navigated diplomatic meetings before, but this wasn't some routine discussion with bureaucrats in Washington. This was Donald Trump and G.D. Vance, and they weren't interested in political theater. The press pool knew it too. The energy in the room had shifted. Reporters who had walked in expecting the usual back and forth about aid and alliances now found themselves scrambling to capture what was quickly becoming a turning point in America's foreign policy. Trump glanced at G.D. Vance, giving him the slightest nod. It was the kind of signal that came from months of working side by side. Vance understood it immediately. "Mr. President," Vance said, turning his attention back to Zelensky, "let's talk specifics. You want another aid package, but you still haven't explained why the United States is doing all the heavy lifting. Why aren't your European allies matching our support, dollar for dollar?" Zelensky pressed his lips together before responding. He had been expecting this question, but the way Vance delivered it, calm, direct, cutting through the usual diplomatic niceties, made it clear this wasn't just another negotiation. "Europe is contributing," Zelensky said, "but America has always been the leader in defending democracy. The world follows where America leads." G.D. Vance leaned back slightly, arms crossed. "That's interesting," he said, "because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they're happy to let us foot the bill while they sit back and watch. Let me ask you something. Why isn't Germany matching our aid? Why isn't France? Why is it that every time you need more, you come straight to Washington?" Zelensky opened his mouth to respond, but Trump cut in before he could. "And let's not forget," Trump said, his voice sharp, "we're sending billions, but Americans at home are struggling. Our borders are open, crime is out of control, our own infrastructure is falling apart. Meanwhile, we keep signing blank checks for a war that has no end in sight." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. The reporters were furiously scribbling notes, typing as fast as they could. This wasn't the answer they had expected. This wasn't the weak, apologetic, diplomatic response they had seen from past administrations. This was something different. Zelensky tried again, his voice measured, but carrying a hint of frustration. "Mr. President, if we don't stop this aggression now, the consequences will extend far beyond Ukraine. This isn't just about one country. This is about global security. If America steps back, the world steps back." Trump smirked. He had heard this argument 1,000 times before. "That's a great speech," he said, waving a hand. "But here's the problem. Americans are tired of hearing about what they have to do for everyone else. Where is the urgency when it comes to protecting our people? Why is it always America that's expected to sacrifice?" G.D. Vance nodded. "And let's be real," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "We've sent you money, weapons, equipment, you name it. But where is the accountability? How much of that aid is actually reaching the front lines, and how much is getting lost in bureaucracy?" Zelensky blinked. G.D. Vance didn't wait for an answer. "Because if you're asking for more," he continued, "then the American people deserve transparency. They deserve to know exactly where their money is going. Because right now, All they see is billions disappearing while their own country is left behind. Trump leaned forward again, locking eyes with Zelensky. "You know what I think, Volodymyr?" he said. "I think it's time for other countries to step up. I think it's time for Europe to pull its weight. And I think it's time for America to focus on America first." The silence in the room was deafening. The press pool looked stunned. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was a shift in power. Zelensky's hands gripped the arms of his chair. He had been prepared for a discussion, even some resistance, but not this. Trump smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Now," he said, "if you want to talk about real solutions, I'm all ears. But if you're here to give me the same speech you gave to Biden, I think we're done here." Zelensky exhaled slowly. He knew this wasn't over. But for the first time since this war had begun, he wasn't in control of the narrative. And the world was watching. The room was silent. The cameras kept rolling, but even the press, so eager to push their own narratives, knew something historic was unfolding before them. This wasn't just another diplomatic meeting. This was a turning point. Zelensky sat motionless, his eyes scanning the room. His polished speech, carefully prepared to rally support, now felt useless. Trump and Vance had dismantled it in real time, exposing every weak spot, every assumption. But Zelensky wasn't new to pressure. He had spent the last few years navigating crises, facing world leaders, and convincing the West that his fight was their fight. He took a slow breath and adjusted his suit, choosing his next words carefully. "Mr. President," he began, his voice steady but cautious, "I understand your concerns. But if America steps back now, if you turn away from this fight, what happens when another country falls? What message does that send to the world?" Vance exchanged a glance with Trump, and a small smirk tugged at the corner of Trump's mouth. "That's the same script we've been hearing for decades," Vance said, shaking his head. "If America doesn't act, chaos will follow. If America doesn't fund it, the world will collapse. But here's the truth, Mr. Zelensky, our people are tired. We've sent billions. We've armed your soldiers. We've been there every step of the way. And yet, every time we turn around, you're back in Washington, asking for more." Trump leaned forward, hands clasped on the desk, his eyes locked onto Zelensky's. "Let me ask you something," Trump said, his voice calm but sharp. "What if we say no?" The words hit like a thunderclap. The journalists in the room stiffened. Even the aides in the background, those who had sat through hundreds of meetings like this, suddenly looked up. No one had ever asked that before. Zelensky hesitated. Trump didn't wait for an answer. "What if we say no?" he repeated. "What if we stop writing blank checks? What if we stop sending weapons? What if we tell Europe to take responsibility for their own backyard? You say the world follows America's lead well. Maybe it's time we lead in a different direction." Vance nodded. "That's the problem with how Washington has run things for years," Vance said. "They throw money at problems instead of demanding results. But that's not leadership. That's just buying time. And we're done buying time." Zelensky exhaled slowly, but the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. He had come into this meeting expecting to reassure Trump, to frame his war as America's war, to appeal to the emotional instincts of past presidents. But this was not the old Washington. Trump and Vance weren't interested in emotional pleas. They were interested in results. "So here's what we're going to do," Trump continued, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. "If you want more aid, there are going to be conditions. Real conditions. No more handouts. No more unlimited spending. We want full transparency. We want to know where every dollar goes. And most importantly, we want to see Europe step up. Zelensky listened carefully. He wasn't used to this kind of negotiation. Under the last administration, support had been given with no questions asked. But now the rules had changed. And one more thing, G.D. Vance added. We expect accountability. No more vague reports. No more trust us speeches. If we're going to keep helping, you're going to have to prove that every single dollar is actually going where you say it is. Zelensky's jaw tightened. And if we refuse these conditions? He asked, his voice measured but firm. Trump shrugged. Then you figure it out without us, he said simply. That's how the real world works. That's how America is going to work under my leadership. No more endless wars. No more endless spending. If we help, it's going to be on our terms. Period. Silence. Zelensky looked between them. He knew he had no choice but to accept. The world was watching. The American people were watching. And for the first time in years, the script had changed. Finally, he gave a slow nod. I understand, he said. Trump smiled satisfied. He stood up, straightening his tie. Good, he said. Because America is done playing by the old rules, with that, he turned to the press, giving them one last knowing smirk. Make sure you report that part, he said before walking out of the room. G.D. Vance followed, giving Zelensky a firm handshake before leaving. The reporters, still reeling, scrambled to process what had just happened. This wasn't just a policy shift. This was the moment everything changed. For the first time in years, Washington was no longer running on autopilot. The days of unlimited aid, unquestioned loyalty, and blank checks were over. America First wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was a reality. What do you think? Should America continue funding foreign wars with no accountability? Should Europe take on more responsibility? Or is it time for a new era of leadership? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in strong leadership and putting America first, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this.